HMS Hood versus Bismarck, the 3-minute battle that shocked Britain. The quarterdeck, naval and military archives, the early hours of a cold morning, 6 o'clock in the morning. The North Atlantic is silent. The sea is cold. Visibility is poor. Two fleets are closing on one another through the mist. On one side, Britain's most famous warship. On the other, Germany's newest and most feared battleship. Neither crew knows that before breakfast, more than 1,400 men will be dead. The battle will last less than 3 minutes, yet its consequences will reshape the naval war in the Atlantic. This is the story of HMS Hood and the battle that shocked Britain. 6:01 in the morning. The North Atlantic is grey, cold, and almost calm. On the horizon, two great shapes converge, one flying the white ensign of Great Britain, the other the war flag of Nazi Germany. Neither commander knows it yet, but in the next 3 minutes, one of the most powerful warships ever built by the Royal Navy will cease to exist. 1,400 men will die in less time than it takes to boil a kettle. This is the story of HMS Hood and the ship that killed her, the Bismarck. HMS Hood versus Bismarck. The 3-minute battle that shocked Britain, setting the record straight. If you watched our first video, you already know how this story ends. You've seen the hunt, days of searching, torpedo bombers launching into the dark, battleships converging on a single wounded ship in the middle of the Atlantic. You've seen the Royal Navy finally catch the Bismarck, but that hunt didn't begin because the Bismarck was simply dangerous. Germany had sent raiders into the Atlantic before. What made this different? What turned a routine interception into a national obsession happened here, in the Denmark Strait, on the morning of the 24th of May, 1941. Before the chase, before the revenge, this is where it actually starts. So consider this the missing chapter, the one that explains why, when Winston Churchill finally got the news he'd been waiting for, his response was just 3 words: sink the Bismarck. To understand why those 3 words mattered so much, you first need to understand what Britain lost that morning. The pride of the Royal Navy launched in August 1918, in the final months of the First World War. HMS Hood was, for 2 decades, the largest warship on Earth, over 260 meters long, displacing more than 46,000 tons at full load. 8 15-inch guns, housed in 4 twin turrets, capable of hurling a shell weighing nearly a ton over 15 miles. But Hood was more than a collection of statistics. She was a symbol, deliberately so. In the 1920s, the Admiralty sent her on what became known as the Empire Cruise, a goodwill tour that carried her over 38,000 nautical miles through ports across the globe, showing the flag and reminding the world that Britannia still ruled the waves. Crowds gathered wherever she docked. Sailors who served aboard her spoke of her with something close to reverence. The British public simply called her the Mighty Hood. By 1941, though, Hood was 23 years old, and she carried a secret weakness that the public never saw, and the Admiralty never quite fixed. Hood was designed in an era when naval doctrine prized speed and firepower above all else, a philosophy shaped by the lessons, or misread lessons, of the First World War. Her deck armor, the horizontal plating meant to protect her from shells falling from above, was thin, dangerously thin, by the standards that would soon matter. Naval engineers had drawn up plans to modernize her for years. Budget constraints, and then the outbreak of war itself, meant those plans were repeatedly delayed, then shelved entirely. She remained, in 1941, essentially the ship she had been in 1920. Magnificent to look at, feared by name, but no longer the most advanced warship afloat. That title now belonged to the ship steaming toward her out of the northern fog. Germany's answer, where Hood was a product of 1918, Bismarck was the opposite. Nazi Germany's answer to 2 decades of naval treaties, restrictions, and rearmament. Commissioned in August 1940, she displaced over 50,000 tons, fully loaded, carried 8 15-inch guns of her own, and was fitted with the newest fire control and range-finding technology German engineering could produce. She was, on paper, everything a modern battleship should be: fast, heavily armored, precisely instrumented. And in May 1941, she was given her first mission: break out into the Atlantic, alongside the heavy cruiser Prince Eugen, and destroy the merchant convoys keeping Britain fed and armed. The operation was codenamed Rheinübung, Rhine Exercise. If Bismarck reached open water undetected, she could threaten to strangle Britain's supply lines exactly as U-boats already had. The Admiralty could not allow that. British intelligence caught wind of the German ships moving through the Baltic and then past Norway, and the hunt to intercept them began before a single shot had been fired. The interception. 2 Royal Navy cruisers, Suffolk and Norfolk, picked up the German ships on radar as they threaded through the ice-choked Denmark Strait, the narrow channel separating Greenland from Iceland, one of the few routes into the open Atlantic from the north. The cruisers shadowed at a distance, radioing position reports, waiting for heavier ships to arrive and finish what they couldn't. That heavier force was Hood, and alongside her, the battleship Prince of Wales, so newly commissioned that civilian dockyard technicians were still aboard, working on her main gun turrets during the voyage north. 2 ships, one a legend nearing the end of her service life, the other barely out of the shipyard, were sent to stop the most modern battleship Germany had ever built. Command of the British force fell to Vice Admiral Lancelot Holland, flying his flag aboard Hood. Despite knowing her deck armor was a liability against exactly this kind of opponent, there was no alternative. She was what Britain had. She sailed anyway. Contact. Just after dawn on the 24th of May, lookouts on both sides spotted smoke on the horizon. The 2 forces closed the distance rapidly, by battleship standards, converging towards something close to point-blank range, roughly 14 miles apart. Prince Eugen opened fire first. Within moments, one of her early salvos struck Hood near the base of her mainmast, hitting a ready-use ammunition locker and starting a fire that spread quickly across her upper deck. In the confusion of low light, drifting smoke, and near-identical silhouettes, Hood's gunnery officers briefly misidentified their target, training their guns on Prince Eugen when the greater threat, Bismarck, was the ship they actually needed to answer. It cost precious minutes. Minutes that, in a battle destined to last only a few more of them, mattered enormously. By the time Hood's guns corrected onto Bismarck, the range had closed further still, and Bismarck's gunners, watching through some of the most advanced optics in the world, had already found their rhythm. The 3 minutes. At 6:01 in the morning, a salvo left Bismarck's forward turrets and crossed more than 9 miles of open water. It found Hood's weakest point exactly. Her deck armor, thin by design, never fully modernized, offered almost no resistance. The shell plunged downward and detonated deep inside one of her magazines, where tons of cordite propellant were stored for her main guns. What followed took less time than it takes to read this sentence aloud. A column of flame tore upward through Hood's hull, visible for miles. Her back broke amidships. Within 3 minutes, some witnesses said less, the largest warship in the Royal Navy, 23 years of British naval pride, was gone. Of her crew of 1,418 men, 1,415 died. It remains, to this day, the single greatest loss of life the Royal Navy has ever suffered aboard one ship. 3 men survived, pulled from the freezing water by the destroyer HMS Electra, which arrived to find almost nothing left to rescue. Nearby, Prince of Wales fought on alone. Her crew, working turrets that civilian technicians had barely finished installing, kept firing and scored real damage. 2 hits struck Bismarck, one of them tearing into her fuel bunkers. But Prince of Wales's own guns began to fail under the mechanical strain of combat, jamming repeatedly, and her captain made the difficult decision to break off the engagement rather than risk losing a second capital ship in a single morning. A victory that wasn't on paper. The Battle of the Denmark Strait was a clear German victory. Bismarck had sunk the most famous ship in the Royal Navy and driven off her escort, all without losing a single crewman. But it was not a clean win. The hit Prince of Wales scored on Bismarck's fuel tanks was more serious than it looked in the moment. Oil was leaking steadily into the sea, and with it, Bismarck's operational range. Admiral Gunther Lütjens, commanding the German force, made a decision that would define the rest of the story: abandon the raid on Atlantic convoys, and instead make for occupied France, where Bismarck could refuel and repair in relative safety. It was a battleship that had just achieved one of the most devastating single strikes in naval history, and it was already running. News of Hood's loss reached London within hours, and it landed like a physical blow. This was not a distant convoy ship or an obscure escort vessel. This was the mighty Hood, the ship that had circled the globe, the ship children drew in schoolbooks, gone in less time than it takes to read a newspaper headline about her. Winston Churchill's response was immediate, and it left no room for interpretation. Find the Bismarck and sink her. Every available warship in the Eastern Atlantic was ordered to converge on the hunt. This was no longer simply about stopping a commerce raider. It was, for the Royal Navy and for Britain, personal. 3 days later, on the 27th of May, they caught her. What happened next, we've already told you, but now you understand why it mattered so much, why an entire fleet was diverted, why torpedo bombers flew into the teeth of anti-aircraft fire in near darkness, why, when Bismarck finally went down, it felt to so many in Britain less like a military victory and more like justice, 3 days delayed. If you haven't seen it yet, the full story of the hunt for the Bismarck is on this channel now. The ship that ended the mighty Hood, and the ship the Royal Navy would not rest until it destroyed in return. Today, the wreck of HMS Hood rests nearly 3 kilometers beneath the North Atlantic. For decades, she represented the might of the British Empire. In just 3 minutes, she became one of the greatest tragedies in Royal Navy history. Ironically, the ship that destroyed her would survive only 3 more days. If you'd like to see how the Royal Navy tracked down and destroyed the Bismarck, that documentary is waiting for you right here on the quarterdeck. Until next time, fair winds, following seas, and thank you for watching. Welcome aboard the quarterdeck. Subscribe and join us for the next chapter for the untold in the Colonial Registry, Naval and Military Achieves.